My name, for those of you who don't know, my name is Allison Holman. I am a professor in the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing. And my area of research is trauma. So I study collective trauma and stress and how people cope with it. And we're now in the process, actually right now in the field, doing a survey, trying to understand how Americans are responding to the war in Ukraine and also various other forms of collective stress that people have been experiencing over the last few years. So that's my background. And I want to thank everybody who's here, including those of you who are here virtually. Thank you for being here. And I especially want to thank the Leider family, Sharon Leider and all of her family, both near and far, for today's lecture, in honor of their loved one, Suzanne Renée Leider, Sharon's daughter. And it's a very special event. Sharon and her family have been strong supporters of the School of Nursing from long before we were a school. They were there with us back in the very beginning and helping us along the way. And they've established a wonderful endowment that is going to help support our students in nursing into perpetuity. So thank you, Sharon, and your family. So I want to tell you a little bit, just a brief bit about Suzanne Renée Leider. Suzanne was 25 years old and deeply into her nursing career and looking forward to continuing her education when she noticed a lump in her thigh. Thinking that she had pulled a muscle while running, she had it looked at, and after much time and many tests, she was diagnosed with virulent synovial cell sarcoma and given less than a year to live. Despite the diagnosis, Suzanne lived for 10 years longer, 11 surgeries, countless chemotherapy infusions, and radiation procedures over 10 years. The Leider family witnessed and were beneficiaries of the loving compassion that sustained and enriched their lives, lives as they lived through this difficult time. And in many ways, the experience of the Leiders and their dedication to providing compassionate care for patients, for people, is one of the cornerstones of why, for my students, why we teach this class. Because it's all about really understanding how do you treat people with the compassion that they deserve? How do you do that in a very difficult and busy medical situation, healthcare situation? So thank you, Sharon, and the Leider family for your dedication to helping us become leaders in educating the next professions, the next set of health professions, the next generation of health professionals about compassion. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to share with you a little bit. I want to introduce for you Dr. Ira Lott. Dr. Lott is a professor emeritus of pediatrics and neurology. He's served as division chief of child neurology for 27 years. He was chair of pediatrics for 10 years and associate dean for clinical neurosciences for 7 years. His research has been continuously funded by NIH for over 30 years. I'm introducing Dr. Lott to you because he's going to come up and share with you a little bit about his experience as a very, very close friend of the Leider family and someone who's known them for many, many, many years. Dr. Lott?
Thank you, Allison, and good evening, everyone. This is the 12th annual lecture by the Leider family in memory of Suzanne Renée Leider, who was an extraordinary person and an extraordinary nurse. Suzanne made the decision to become a nurse during her undergraduate days at UCLA, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of San Francisco and became a nurse at UCSF in the kidney transplant program. Shortly thereafter, she developed a sarcoma, which would take her life after a 10-year fight wherein she would continue to work and teach despite her personal vicissitudes. Suzanne would be the first to tell you about her sarcoma, its biology, its treatment, and her personal reaction to it. She was, in the eyes of her medical team, someone who was eternally optimistic and at the same time deadly realistic. I recall when my wife and I took her to lunch, she said to the waiter, "Of course we will wait for the chocolate souffle. How many more am I going to have?" She would ask others, "What books should I read while I still can?" This unflinching honesty in the face of her struggles with cancer is a personal attribute which few of us see in our lifetime. Suzanne's approach to nursing was holistic. She resisted over-specialization and concentrated on the historical focus of the nursing profession to show compassion and hands-on assistance to her patients. She loved to teach, but was no pushover. She demanded excellence, and her students loved her. During the difficult days of her hospitalization, as soon as the family left the room, it would fill with nursing colleagues and students. One would play the guitar, one would hold her hand. Were they comforting her, or was she comforting them? Knowing Suzanne, it was undoubtedly some of both. She looked beyond her illness and founded the Sarcoma Alliance, now a national organization providing guidance, education, and support for the 17,000 patients with sarcoma in the United States. Many of us have her cookbook, in which Suzanne, looking beyond herself, as usual, wrote in the preface, "I hope to give inspiration to cancer patients and to our loved ones who work so closely with us to maximize our healing." I'd like to address my final remarks to the nursing students. You did not know Suzanne Leider, but she was one of you, one of us, one of everyone in the healing profession. The Leider family hopes, as you look back on this evening and the remarks of Dean Lazenby, that you will embrace the legacy of Suzanne Leider and incorporate it into the important professional work that you do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lott, for that wonderful introduction for all of us to Suzanne and who she was. Dr. Lott and his wife, Ruth, have also been friends of the School of Nursing for many, many years, going way back before we were a school. And we want to thank them for their committed dedication to our growth and our trajectory forward as we become a larger, more well-known school in the country. Okay, what I'd like to do now is introduce for you the main speaker for the night, Dr. Mark Lazenby, also Dean Mark Lazenby. He is going to be giving a lecture tonight on the nature of suffering and the practice of nursing. But let me tell you a little bit about Dean Lazenby. Dean Lazenby is a nurse philosopher, professor, and he comes to UCI, Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing, from the University of Connecticut School of Nursing, where he was the Associate Dean for Faculty and Student Affairs, where he did a ton of work to help build diversity in that school. And he was there from 2019 to 2022. And before that, he was at Yale, where he held a joint appointment in nursing and divinity. His PhD, by the way, is in philosophy. As an international expert on psychosocial cancer care, Dean Lazenby's research has been profoundly involved with the spiritual support of cancer patients. He has practiced and conducted research in Jordan, Botswana, and the United States, giving him a broad basis for understanding the human experience of cancer. His book publications with Oxford University Press have attracted a global audience from well beyond the nursing community to consider the meaning and the importance of nursing. He is a passionate advocate for the profession, always emphasizing the good that nurses do and the necessity for identifying and supporting the aspiring and diverse nurse leaders of the next generation. Please welcome Dean Mark Lazenby.
Thank you, Professor Holman. Thank you, Dr. Lott, Mrs. Leider, the Leider family who's virtually. I'm grateful to your support of this lecture and of our students. Let me get my text here, because this is more properly a philosophy of nursing talk. I'm going to define compassion in this talk. Of course, compassion is to suffer with, as it's just plain on its face, come with, and passion, suffering. This talk has two parts: to define the nature of suffering, and then the second part to say what the practice of nursing is in response to suffering. So, without further ado, let me begin. To be human is to suffer. Humans have long tried to understand and explain this fact of the human condition. The ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus tells us in his tragedy he wrote in the 5th century before the Common Era, Prometheus Bound, that Zeus punished the Titan Prometheus with lifelong suffering for having stolen fire from the gods and given it to humans. Before Prometheus's intervention, fire had only belonged to the gods, and Zeus punished Prometheus by chaining him to a rock and sending an eagle to pluck out his liver during the day. At night, Prometheus's liver regenerated, only for the eagle to return the next day to pluck it away again. Of course, because Prometheus was half human as a Titan, he felt the pain of the mortal wound inflicted by the eagle. But because he was half divine, he did not die from the wound. When the eagle left at night, the human side of Prometheus felt the pain of healing. Healing itself is often painful. Thus Prometheus suffered without end. The eagle landed and plucked his liver healed, and on it went. In 1618 AD, the Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens depicted Prometheus' suffering in a piece now displayed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In Aeschylus' play, Prometheus' never-ending punishment may have been at divine order, but Prometheus understood the experience in human, not divine terms. Humans without fire could not cook, warm themselves, see well at night, or fend off coyotes. Indeed, Prometheus' suffering for his fellow humans who did not have the essential element of fire led him in the end to his own suffering. His compassion for humans led him to his own suffering. It was as if Zeus said, if you're going to show compassion for your fellow human, you will suffer as humans suffer. Prometheus' reply in the play was, suffering is a migrant bird that settles. Suffering, like death, is inevitable. The 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said that death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death, though we all know, whether or not we like to admit it, that death shall one day come for us. And we do experience others' deaths. Knowledge of death causes us to suffer. Unlike us, however, Prometheus does not die. This is his divinity. In the myth, he is still today chained to the rock, enduring the suffering of compassion for humanity. Some may say that his physical pain is sufficient cause of his suffering. It certainly is part of it, but it is not the sum. Pain, as the contemporary essayist Elaine Scarry, the Harvard English professor, reminds us, has its etymological home in the Latin poena, which is the same root as punishment. Prometheus's punishment was his physical pain, and that was his human side. But Prometheus also bore the knowledge of the punishment that had been visited upon him for the good deed. And he knew that his suffering would be constant. It was a migrant bird that settled. Rather than suffering from the knowledge of inevitable death, Prometheus suffers from his knowledge of the eagle's inevitable return. Suffering, no matter the cause, is to be conscious, aware of pain. It is quite literally to bear, to be put under, to carry, or to endure conscious awareness of pain. Suffering cuts to the core of what it means to be human. To be human, after all, is to have consciousness. It is to have awareness. To be human is also to be connected with other humans. It is through this connectedness that one has consciousness or awareness of one's own destiny. Destiny, the shape of one's future and the future of the human community. Hope is predicated on the awareness of destiny, of consciousness of destiny. If only for the hope of our progeny. My son tells me I shouldn't place so much hope in him, but I do. Or for the continuance of human history in the material world. Events such as war, such as mass shootings, that call into question the connectedness of our humanity and the continuance of human history frighten us because they disrupt our consciousness, our awareness of the future. And therefore they can leave us without a sense of hope. To be human is to have a sense of our world and our ability to shape the future of our world, to shape our destiny. Prometheus, chained to the rock, was helpless and hopeless because he could not flee or protect himself or have a hand in his future. The possibilities of war today, given thermonuclear weaponry, threaten even the natural world with total destruction. And in fact, I haven't been afraid of that as much as since we were kids, some of us who are gray, right, and used to have to practice duck and cover. And now it is again a reality. To be human, however, I'm arguing, is to be harmonious with nature, and it is the possible disruption with nature that frightens us. To be human is to have an expectation of our future supported by the natural world. Prometheus and nature were no longer in harmony. Nature was red in beak and talon. And rather than a stepping stone to the heavens, the rock to which Prometheus was bound was a bed of torture. The Hebrew Scriptures also tackle the fundamental nature of human suffering as disconnection with humanity, one's own and that of others, and with nature. In this version, suffering originated when God banished Adam and Eve from Eden, the garden of eternal life, where God himself walked in the cool of each day. He banished them for disobeying the divine command not to eat of the tree of knowledge. He exiled them to the desert, where God did not go, and where they would one day die. Adam and Eve's suffering, like Prometheus's, arose from their punishment that resulted in their being disconnected, helpless, hopeless, and inharmonious with nature. Theirs was a spiritual suffering. When one, in the grip of suffering, is disconnected from others and from nature, one loses a sense of oneself in the human community and the natural world. One is trapped, and the experience of suffering, because of its disconnectingness, cannot be shared with others. One cannot express suffering. One is caught in a wordless world in which meaning is a meaningless world to which others do not have access. In an undated interview with the Living and Dying Project, Suzanne Leider expresses this aspect of suffering, and I quote directly from her. She said, "I feel disconnected from my cohort group. No longer was I the young adult full of hope and plans for the future. I was an anomaly on a very different path. This sense of disconnection, along with the rarity of my illness, stirred in me feelings of isolation." In my practice as an oncology nurse practitioner, patients often describe their experience as being trapped in suffering that was at the hands of an external force that acted upon them, cancer. This language of giving agency to a seemingly external force like cancer is an attempt to exit the wordless world of suffering. It is an attempt, Elaine Scarry says, to objectify one's suffering. Nurses may have encountered patients who've been dealt a heavy blow of a life-limiting diagnosis, but who approach their diagnosis and sometimes their physical pain as the presence of wanted spiritual suffering. This is often true of people who believe in karma or in redemptive suffering. The contemporary psychologist Paul Bloom says that for suffering to be wanted, it must have a meaning. The meaning is the object of suffering. Now let me depart from my text here and talk a little bit about Paul Bloom. His book, The Sweet Spot, I recommend to you all. He talks about chosen and wanted suffering. Let me give you an example of chosen and wanted suffering. This is someone who may be training for a marathon. They actually choose to suffer, and they want the suffering. They want to feel the burn, build their VO2 max in their lungs and all of that. And when they're mile 20 and they've hit the wall, supposed wall, right, that is something that they've worked hard to get past. It's chosen and wanted suffering. And it has an object to finish the marathon, to finish at a certain time, etc. So that type of suffering has meaning. There's chosen but unwanted suffering. So the marathoner you've seen who just can't make it past the finish line and they're crawling on the asphalt to get over. They did not want that end, right? But they did choose to run the race. But now I'm talking about unchosen and unwanted suffering. Unchosen and unwanted suffering, like cancer, is objectless. There is no reason, no meaning that justifies it. There is, quite literally, no point to it. Let me engage in a little bit more philosophizing than I have done so far about what is the nature of an object. Because for something to have meaning, it must have an object. An object is external to our language. It's external to our thinking and to our mind. As such, an object is a referent. Now, I have the word pointer. This is the object. When I use the word pointer actually points to the pointer. Right? The word pointer points to this, which is the referent. A referent is that to which one's words and thoughts point. It is essential that when one talks or thinks, because we all think in words, have you noticed? I've tried not to think in words and it didn't work. When one talks or thinks about something, our words have reference. That is, it is essential that our words point to objects that give our words meaning. When there is no object, there is nothing to point to outside us. And that is how one is trapped in a wordless world of suffering. It is the world of isolation that Suzanne Leider talked about. Because unchosen and unwanted suffering has no object, we do not have words to describe it. It defies language. One can, of course, say that one suffers. This suffering can be caused by pain, or in the case of Prometheus, by compassion for others. But as I said, a cause is not a reason. It's not an object. It doesn't give meaning. Suffering, because it is inaccessible to language, often leaves us groaning. That is, nurses will, making groans, but also sometimes making nonsensical utterances. The Christian apostle Paul puts the insight this way: the Spirit maketh intercessions for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Universally, groans and seemingly nonsensical utterances, which often come out as contradictions, are attempt to supply an object or a referent to unwanted and unchosen suffering. I've encountered these contradictions clinically, when patients say they suffer, but they don't know where, they can't locate it. Or when they ask why God allowed this to happen to them, and then you inquire further, and they say they don't believe in God. Objects connect us as humans to something outside of us. If you believe, to God, to eternal life, to wisdom, to nature, to loved ones, to your progeny, to your books, my books, so forth. Objects connect us to something. Why do we pick up mementos when we go someplace and bring them home? They connect us to the place and to the memories. Unchosen and unwanted suffering, that is objectless suffering, on the contrary, creates an absolute split between one's reality and what would otherwise be the object. if one's suffering had not occurred. The life that could have been. Objectless suffering alienates us from God, from that which we believe, from nature, from our loved ones, from the future, even from our bodies. And nurses will often hear a sufferer say they don't feel like they're in their body anymore. Objectless suffering creates a world in which sufferers suffer alone, in which they find themselves in suffering-imposed solipsism, meaning the only thing that exists is their own mind. Their suffering, as I say, is completely inaccessible. While sufferers have a complete grasp of their suffering because it's in here, others do not and cannot. Because of this inaccessibility, what sufferers grasp and hence easily know can be doubted and denied by others. The importance of this insight about how others can easily doubt how we can easily doubt other suffering was made to me by my mentor, a cancer nurse and a nurse philosopher in her own right, Ruth Mccorkle, who was also a symptom management researcher. Her experiences as an Air Force nurse during Vietnam led her to this insight. In the planes that transported wounded soldiers and often dying soldiers from the field hospitals to base hospitals, Mccorkle witnessed soldiers' physical wounds. But their suffering, she said, was within. Even when they could talk, they groaned because they were in this solipsistic world of suffering. She wanted to believe them, but she said that often others on the plane would say, "It's not that bad of a wound. Why are you crying?" I'm sure a lot of us nurses have heard that said clinically too. But she knew that their crying was a wordless expression of their internal suffering, of their consciousness, of their awareness, of the split, of the alienation that had happened. Later, she worked in the 1970s at Massachusetts General Hospital with the psychiatrist Avery Weissman and the psychologist William Worden, who had, for patients diagnosed with cancer, given this wordless suffering a name: existential plight. Weissman and Worden defined existential plight as a feeling of vulnerability, mood disturbances, and concerns about the future of one's existence. When the face of death visits, even by, in the 70s particularly, the word cancer, when the face of death visits, one is trapped by its sight, as Prometheus was on the rock. Even if death's face merely passes by, it causes suffering that defies language. Because as Wittgenstein told us, death is not an event in life. It is the complete alienation from this life. And we have awareness of that. Eric Cassell, in his foundational 1982 article in the New England Journal of Medicine, titled "The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine," defined suffering as the state of severe distress associated with events that threaten the intactness of a person. Now, I've been laying the groundwork to show how this intactness is disrupted by alienation, by the split of one's consciousness from the future to the very inward inexpressibility of suffering. Suffering's objectlessness, its trapped in your own mind solipsism, its alienation, calls into question the sufferer's personhood. It's just not that suffering resists language, but in so doing, it reverses us to a prelingual state. That is, to a stage in human development that is pre-sense. As such, when we suffer, we lose the ability to make sense of ourselves in the world. This prelingual, pre-sense state is a state before we have awareness of our personhood, a state in which we cannot comprehend our existence. It is in this state before personhood in which sufferers lose awareness that they are alive. And that's perhaps the biggest cause of suffering, the loss of awareness that one is alive. This point has been beautifully illustrated by the title of a book. The radio host in the United Kingdom who has life-limiting colon cancer, Deborah James, just released a few days ago, titled, How to Live When You Could Be Dead. How to Live When You Could Be Dead. Others can respond to the prelingual groans of sufferers who have lost awareness of aliveness with aversion. Not just aversion at the crying soldier on the plane, or the person who apparently has it all together but is depressed or anxious or has a migraine or some other cause of pain that's not visible. This aversion results from catching a glimpse of the sufferer's loss of awareness of being alive. After all, it is part of human nature to turn away from death, to flee from it, to preserve one's life. The objectlessness of death is abhorrent. To summarize what I've said so far, to be human is to suffer. It is a fate we all share. It involves the essence of being human. But suffering reverses us to a wordless state of being. Wordlessness is meaninglessness. And unchosen and unwanted suffering is meaningless. And it shows us the greater source of our suffering, namely death. And from death, as I say, we avert our gaze. And here's the second part of my talk. Nurses, however, cannot avert their gaze or turn away. Nurses must be present. For presence, the contemporary nurses Betty Farrell and Nessa Coyle say in their 2008 book, The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Nursing, is the essential task of the nurse. Presence is not easy to define. There is no single action that, when complete, could be checked off the to-do list to say, I was present today to my patient. It's not an action per se. Rather, it's more a state of being. The English origin of the word presence, the Latin praesentia, literally means to be at hand, to be there at the ready in the moment. Presence is fundamentally being in the presence of another person in a certain place, at a certain time, not consumed with other tasks, but rather being. I am here, we say without words to a sufferer who has no words when we walk into the presence, into their presence. Being present, showing up, is the foundation of nursing presence to me. Showing up, being there. Presence includes an awareness also of what we share with others, the human connection. The contemporary feminist bioethicist Margaret Farley says that presence is to find a location in human experience in which you encounter the reality of others and yourself. When we as nurses are present to others who suffer, we encounter our own common humanity. We encounter the possibility of our own suffering and indeed the suffering that we have felt ourselves. To be human, after all, is to be vulnerable to suffering. To be present to others who suffer is to overcome our urge to avert our gaze from them in their prelingual, pre-sense state, a state in which they only have groans and writhing to express themselves. When we show up and do not avert our gaze from sufferers, but rather are with them, we bring out their prelingual and pre-sense world. We bring them out of it. We bring them out of the world in which they're trapped, the world of isolation, and usher them back into the world of aliveness. Nursing presence is being for the individual what the individual needs you to be for them to be alive. Mccorkle understood the power of nursing presence. On one of the transport planes, I've written about this in a book, and I have it on first-person authority, the story. So on one of the transport planes, a young mortally wounded soldier who was groaning from his wounds asked Mccorkle for his mother and his girlfriend. "Where are they?" he asked. He was terrified of the aloneness of his suffering and what he knew was to come, his death. It was ostensibly a nonsensical question because he knew he was in a plane being transported from the battlefield to a hospital in Hawaii and his family were on the mainland. But his question arose from the suffering of being chained to Prometheus's rock. He knew he could not escape it. And he knew that he was isolated. And Mccorkle recognized this. She told me she held his hand and said, "I am here. I will not leave you." He died moments later. After this event and her tour was complete, she returned to her studies and wrote one of her greatest works, I think, on the effects of touch on the seriously ill. Touch, after all, is a bridge between living things when there are no words. Touch is the first step in giving words back to sufferers. Touch overcomes the aversion to death. Mccorkle went on to have an illustrious career, professor at University of Washington, University of Pennsylvania, Yale. She was founder of modern palliative care nursing. She treated people who were diagnosed with life-limiting cancer. In the 1970s, she studied in the United Kingdom with Dame Cecily Saunders at St. Christopher's Hospice and the psychiatrist J.M. Hinton, who in his 1963 article published in QJM, an International Journal of Medicine, The Physical and Mental Distress of the Dying, he described a connection between dying patients' unrelieved physical distress and their mental distress. This relationship had only been described once before by Sir William Osler in 1906 in his book, Science and Immortality, in which he described the observations of nearly 500 dying patients at Johns Hopkins and found a relationship between unrelieved physical distress and mental apprehension. Following Osler and Hinton, Mccorkle conducted a study in which she developed a scale that would, for sufferers, name a physical symptom, its frequency. Do you have a cough? Yes, no. Do you have nausea, vomiting? Yes, no. And then she attached to that scale, yes, no, the frequency, a rating scale, in which she asked sufferers, how much does this bother you? 0 is no distress, 10 is extreme distress. She was interested in identifying the point at which untreated cancer-related symptoms pushed patients into wordless suffering. From this study came the Mccorkle Symptom Distress Scale. This scale was 1979. It was the first pain scale really out there for any cancer patient. It was simple but profound in its truth. It was the first of its kind because it violated what was at the time considered to be psychometric protocol, in which you did not mix the dimension of frequency, yes, no, with the dimension of a rating, 0 to 10. She took quite a lot of heat for it. However, now every symptom inventory uses such a mixed dimension approach. For the approach gives sufferers the chance to name the source and the burden of their suffering. It brings sufferers out of wordlessness. It ushers them out of the prelingual, present state of suffering and into the worded world, a world of aliveness. Giving unwanted and unchosen suffering a name is not giving it a reason. There is no reason for unchosen and unwanted suffering. Some people may not ever find meaning in their suffering, and some may not want to. But to say this pain, these pins and needles, this nausea and vomiting, this is what's causing me not to feel like myself. It's naming the source. Elaine Scarry says to name the source is to give an object, a referent to the person whose suffering is physical. And for nurses, that's what we call nursing assessment. That's nursing presence. Now both sufferer and nurse speak the same words. They have the same object in view, and hence the sufferer is no longer alone. Suzanne Leider in the interview said that her feelings of isolation did not subside until I met another young and vibrant woman with the same disease and similar struggles. Of course, Suzanne was a nurse, and as a nurse, she had the skills to objectify her physical suffering. And I suspect that she, as a suffering nurse, helped this other young woman to objectify her suffering too. This object may be physical. It may also be emotional. But I contend that it is always spiritual, in that, following Eric Cassell, it calls into question the intactness of the person. When we're no longer intact as a person, it is a spiritual crisis. In the last article Ruth Mccorkle wrote, which she wrote just a few weeks before her own death from an Agent Orange-related cancer, which she got from pulling off the boots of the soldiers on the transport planes. she advocated for treating physical suffering first and then moving on to other sources of distress. After all, physical symptoms are experienced by people, not by bodily organs. Just as it is difficult to concentrate when one is hungry, when one is tired, it is also difficult to attend to spiritual distress when one is physically or emotionally suffering. Once nurses have addressed the physical and emotional sources of distress as best they can, the spiritual, however, often remains, and Suzanne knew this. But again, as a nurse, she knew to attend to her own spiritual well-being. And here's the quote from that interview. She said, "During the early years of my illness, I followed the spiritual path of nature. I hiked frequently on Mount Tamalpais and trekked and backpacked in such places as Yosemite. I found peacefulness, a deep sense of spirituality by being in nature. As my disease progressed, I had a very brief and profound experience with a Jewish mystic whose teachings I practice to this day. Practicing Judaism, especially the mystical aspects of the religion, has brought me a sense of the sacred." She also said, "During the last 4 years, I have explored yoga, meditation, practices that have helped me integrate peace and a sense of wellness into my daily life. I have read many books on Buddhism, as well as consider Pema Chodron's writing on the practice of Tonglen for cultivating compassion to be a great path for me." Suzanne used spiritual practices to bring herself back from suffering's reversion to a prelingual, presense state, to being aware of her aliveness, even as she was dying. She said, "I try to communicate that even though I have pain and do suffer, I also experience tremendous amounts of joy and satisfaction in my life." Through spiritual practices, she grabbed a hold of life even as she suffered. Nurses encounter suffering individuals when they're surrounded by other healthcare professionals, each treating a different aspect of the individual. In the complexity of our modern healthcare system, nurses provide an intimate, personal encounter. An encounter in which nurses become the confidant, the vessel of individual suffering, and the counselor for their spiritual distress. The nurse touches the sufferer, assesses the sufferer, then becomes the vessel of words that sufferers no longer have. The nurse names and thus objectifies another person's suffering. The nurse becomes life for sufferers who no longer have the strength within themselves for being alive. This is the practice of nursing presence when attending to people who experience unwanted suffering. It is overcoming aversion toward objectless suffering and being life for those whose suffering has caused them to question their very own personhood. The practice of nursing in response to suffering is not just for palliative care nurses. It's for nurses who are the consciousness of aliveness for unhoused, hungry, and jobless individuals. It is for environmental nursing, for the earth, which sustains all of our lives, suffers from our destructive behaviors. And it is for nurses ourselves, who have provided care to unspeakable suffering, particularly during the COVID pandemic. Being present to unspeakable suffering may cause nurses to suffer in the same way that Prometheus' suffering was due to his compassion for, his feeling with the suffering of his fellow human. Compassion is, after all, suffering with another. Nurses, we suffer. And it is for the nursing community to be present to each other in ways that we only can. This, too, is the practice of nursing. Suffering is all around, in every setting, across diseases, in people of all ages. Suffering is part of being human. But being present to those who suffer, being life to those who need aliveness, is compassion. It is the everyday work of nurses. Thank you very much. Questions? Sure, I'll take questions. Paige, yes. Thank you.
But I had experience of being in Schwartz rounds. I'm a director of nursing at UCSD in oncology, and those rounds are
an alumna from our
an alumni
PhD
from your
program.
PhD program. And in those rounds, one of the nurses described that is an opportunity for us to process a particular death that is very challenging for the entire team. And one of the nurses talked about after the death of one of her patients that it was a long-time married couple, and the wife had to walk back to her car that night, and everybody else had left, and she was going to do so alone. And the nurse said, she was nervous about offering because she didn't know what she would say. And she told us that she said nothing. They walked in silence, and she was that presence where there was no words.
Yeah.
So really touching.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you for that example.
Dean Lazenby, we are also monitoring with our virtual audience.
Yes.
So maybe you can encourage them if they have a question.
Yes, if you have a question, I think you put it in the chat. Is that right? Thank you. Well, Ruth Lott had her hand up. Go ahead.
I'm curious if you've ever given this wonderful lecture to physicians.
I have not. You're the first person you're the first group who've heard this lecture. So, no, I have not. I will, in full disclosure, I want to thank several people who gave me comments ahead of time, including Betty Farrell, who read this and gave me some comments, and Miriam Binder, among several others. But no, you're the inaugural hearers of it.
From Zoom.
Yes.
Let's see. How and why do pets seem to relieve suffering frequently without touch?
I wish I don't know, but let me philosophize. I do think that when I say to be human is to have consciousness and awareness, of course I don't know if pets have consciousness and awareness. It's hard to know. Well, you're the scientists, I don't know. But anyway, but when I walk home at night and I'm particularly stressed, Pluto somehow knows how to sidle up next to me, right? He has a real uncanny ability to sense my mood. I can't remember the names of these dog scholars. They're at Hampshire College and Yale, yes. I can't remember their names right now. Some may say that that's an adaptive behavior by dogs because It is a way for them to make sure that they're going to survive, right? If their owner is distressed, they have every reason to want to relieve that distress so that the owner will feed them and care for them, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other studies that suggest that when you pet a dog particularly, that the dog releases dopamine and you release dopamine, and dopamine is the bonding hormone, as you know. And so I regularly, Pluto, I think, sidles up next to me when I've had a stressful day, because he wants the dopamine hit as much as I want the dopamine hit, right? And if you call that an adaptive behavior, that's okay. I'm fine with it. But I do think it hits at this notion of connection, right? And when humans touch other humans, dopamine is also released. And there is something very important about the presence, the physical touch, the being with others in their suffering, that I suspect that we could drill down and find sort of biophysiological explanations for, which would be unsatisfactory in the end, because it is about the connection. Yeah, Ellie Weinstein, yeah.
Thank you. I have always found the poem by John Milton very moving about presence. And he wrote this as he was going blind. I think it's called On His Blindness. But it ends with, "Blessed are those who sit and wait." And I've often thought that expressed presence and the importance of it, because he starts out with all the people that try to do things for him, but the people who just come and sit there is very comforting in the long run.
Absolutely. Now, thank you. I will integrate the poem in the next version of the
Right.
talk.
That's why I brought it up to you. I think it's very important.
Thank you, Ellie.
Thank
It is
you.
very, very good.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Caitlin. I'm a nurse at UCI. And I just wanted to thank you because this lecture really struck a chord with me where I'm at in nursing right now. I have just left the bedside and I took a position as the magnet program coordinator. But it's like leaving bedside has been very challenging for me, because as nurses, I think our identity is, it's kind of like you said, it's like experiencing the suffering with our patients, and it gave me meaning in life, you know, and every day you would come home grateful. And so I just, you know, I know there's students in here, and I'm a nursing professor as well, and I try to always portray this to them, but that interaction with your patients is so, they give me more than I could ever give them. Yeah. And, you know, I'm really missing that right now, but I will find ways to integrate it. But, so I just wanted to thank you for that and kind of giving words to what I've been feeling. So, thank you.
You're
That's
welcome.
very touching.
And you're making it possible for other nurses to be at the bedside, so your work is very important. So, yeah, Professor Holman.
So going back to pets, I have a, you know, from my view, and maybe I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit here, and so what? But to a degree, a pet provides comfort in part. Maybe it's the dopamine hit too, but it's just the unconditional acceptance. Mm-hmm. You're just accepted.
Yeah.
And so that brings me to another question. Excuse me. That has to do with how we other people. And we don't give them unconditional acceptance.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, part of my commitment in this class and in the classes I teach is about helping people deal with the reasons why we do that to people, but also to find ways to help people realize that it's really important not to do that, that compassion requires that we overcome the things, the barriers that we
Yes.
have to connecting.
Yes, absolutely. And whatever we think of nursing, the one thing it has to be is for all with preference for the vulnerable. The other people, as you say. I don't have a... I was speaking today with a young man, Orlando Harris. I encourage you to look him up. He's at UCSF and in the nursing school. He's working in the space of Jamaican men who are HIV positive in a climate change reality, in which there are many natural disasters on Jamaica, hurricanes that are climate-related events that disrupt them from their care. And they become the lowest on the totem pole, right, of concerns of people, way down at the bottom. And it was unsurprising, but also confirming to me why we're nurses, to hear him say, that's what my research is about. That's for whom that's why I'm in nursing. They are the people. And I think we are as nurses, first and foremost, for the people who, because of whatever conditions of life that are unchosen and unwanted, place them in that state of vulnerability, that chain them to Prometheus's rock. And we do have an obligation, more than others, to attend to them. And compassion is being with them in suffering, absolutely. And giving them life, to unchain them from the rock. Yeah.
If I may.
Yeah.
I think that there are people that we other, that we exclude, that we push away, that we refuse to connect with, who didn't choose suffering.
No, that's right.
And who embrace who they are, but didn't choose suffering, and yet they suffer.
Yeah.
Because of the way they're treated, which is what I think is really important for all of us to think about, is that what can we do as individuals? How can we be willing to look in that mirror and say, what am I doing in the way I'm relating to the next person or the other person, this next person? What am I doing that may be getting in the way of a genuine human connection?
Yeah. I think it is, the sort of looky-loo phenomenon aside, I think it is natural to turn away from suffering. No one wants, because when you see suffering, you immediately say, that could happen to me. It conjures up this kind of awareness of our vulnerability as humans. To not look away, but rather to go to and be present, right? To assess, to name, to be with, it is a non-baser response. It is the response of the moral self. And that is at the heart of nursing's moral character.
Dean Lazenby, in your books, you often speak of nursing as sacred work. Mm-hmm. And it was just portrayed so beautifully here. And I'm somewhat speechless, but I just had to say, I think it's so beautiful how you brought Suzanne here today. Oh. And I know she's with us, and I know it's felt by all here, especially the Leider family and close friends. But thank you. It was just so beautiful.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
Wow, right? Wow, powerful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very powerful talk today. Okay, so now I get to do the fun stuff, the really fun stuff, because it's my honor to announce the Suzanne Renée Leider Nursing Endowment Awardees. Some of them were my students last year, and I'm very happy to hear this. So I would like to announce 5 awardees. Ms. Jessica Hernandez. Jessica, are you here? I didn't see you. Okay. I don't see Lacey. Is Lacey here? Lacey Lawson? Okay, okay. Matthew Lee. Okay. Shelby Lee. Hey, there we go. Woohoo! Congratulations, Shelby. And Ling Yi Lei. No. Okay, so 4 out of 5 are not here tonight. I can tell you, I know Jessica Hernandez, Lacey Lawson, and Matthew Lee. I taught them in my compassionate care for underserved populations last year, and they are awesome. They are going to make fantastic nurses, and I really look forward to seeing them flourish as nurses when they get out there. Okay, so it is now time for the closing. I want to say thank you to all of you who are future healthcare practitioners, nurses, doctors, physical therapists, surgeons, whatever path you choose to go. And I'm speaking to my students. Not all my students this quarter are nursing students, but we are very proud that you guys want to go into the health professions. We're confident that you're going to do well. We're confident that you're going to find ways to weave compassion into the work you do throughout your lives and your practice. I always say that what you do in your everyday life is part of how you practice as a professional as well. So putting it into practice, walking that walk in every step of your life is a really important part of really showing compassion. So a final thought on Suzanne. It was very clear that her calling was nursing. Despite being encouraged by others to attend medical school, she pursued a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing. She went to the University of San Francisco, and when she graduated in 1991, she began her nursing career at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in San Francisco, ultimately making her way to UCSF in the kidney transplant unit. When nursing was no longer physically possible, she focused on teaching. And I want to encourage some of you who are planning to go into nursing that you think about coming back to teach, because teaching is it's a way to pass that baton and to pass on the wisdom and the brilliance that you get from the practice to the next generation. She also pursued graduate studies with the dream of earning a doctorate in nursing. She loved her patients, students, doctors, and fellow nurses. So today we came together in celebration of her resilient spirit and courage. I thank Dean Lazenby for his fantastic, you brought Suzanne into the room. She was here and she heard. So thank you. It was very beautifully done. And I want to thank again Sharon Leider and her family for making this award possible for the 12th year. Yes, you heard 12th year. And thank all of you friends and family who came today in person, and those of you who are there with us virtually, who have supported the Suzanne Renée Leider Lecture Series and the Endowment and invested in the potential of our future nurses. You have made these awards possible today and this whole event possible. So thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to invite you to a reception in honor of this year's Student Scholar Award winners. Unfortunately, several of them aren't here, but we will definitely be celebrating Shelby. Shelby's up. All right, thank you.
The award recipients are attending virtually.
Oh, they are here virtually. Shout out to Jessica, Lacey, Matthew, and Ling for being here virtually. Thank you. You guys are awesome. I can't wait to hear more from you and see you in practice. Thank you, everybody.